Oh, good afternoon. This is Poetrio for the month of June, and I'm excited to have three wonderful poets in the house, and also to know that our wonderful viewers and listeners are out there with us on this lovely afternoon. And I will introduce Angela Narciso Torres first and her book, What Happens Is Neither. Since you already have the bios of the readers, I'm not going to mention the bios, but I will talk about the poetry briefly. And also at the end of the reading, prepare some questions. If you have any questions for the poets, feel free to put them in the chat and the poets will be happy to answer them for you. So my name is Mildred Barya, and this is my takeaway when I read Angela's book. Angela's book performs the work of prayer, music, and ritual as the poet lovingly recalls folk wisdom and proverbs from one's childhood, how they are committed to memory when the adults who passed them on are no longer capable of remembering. In its aphoristic nature, What Happens Is Neither evokes emotions that acknowledge loss, but the poems are also resonant with the kind of grace and respect that can never be lost or forgotten. Please, let's welcome Angela. Thank you.
Thank you, Mildred, for that very thoughtful and really quite moving introduction. I'm so grateful for the time you spent reading and commenting on my book. Thank you, Malaprops, for having us today. I have warm memories of your store from my MFA days at Warren Wilson nearby. I remember looking with envy at all the books of Warren Wilson faculty and students that had been published and that were in display at your store during my residency days off there. And when we'd sneak out for real Asian food in Asheville, then hang out at the store. So it's really, truly an honor to read here, even virtually. This is my book, What Happens Is Neither, and it's an homage to my parents, whom I lost 2 years ago, my mother to Alzheimer's and my father to cancer a week later. The book is part elegy and part meditation on loss, as you may have gathered from Mildred's introduction, which to me, loss is the essential condition of being human. And the book looks through various lenses of mother, immigrant daughter, writer, and other roles, exploring the indomitability of the human spirit and the search for meaning in the midst of profound change and loss. As many of you know, any loss forces you to look back and to remember. In my case, my strongest impulse was to record. This first poem is a remembrance of my mother. She was a physician, but also a pianist and a wonderful cook and a great storyteller. I wrote this to continue the stories and to record everything I could as her dementia began to progress and her memories began to fade. Sundowning for my mother, Carmen. The sweetest meat clings to the bone, my mother says, knifing her steak. Carmen, silver spade on her tongue. Mahjong nights, her mother and father gone, she cried herself to sleep, blamed in the morning for her mother's losing hand. Unlucky tears. The sweetest meat, she begins at dinner, tearing off a drumstick. What will she recall by morning? Named for our mother of Mount Carmel, she pinned brown scapulars under our shirts, wet stamps that cleave to our backs. Carmen, prayer on the breath. Amid potted ferns, she works a jigsaw puzzle. Bizet on the radio. Unable to sleep, she made me lie next to her. My brothers clambered the banyan trees. My legs twitched, a broken clock. Her kisses are guava and rust. She sings kundimans her mother sang. Sampaguita, dahil sa'yo, saan ka man. Sunday morning, puzzle pieces strewn on yesterday's news, Maria Callas on the phonograph. Carmen, citrine fire. When she plays the piano, the lovebirds fall silent. Alabaster eggs tremble in glass bowls. Afternoons, she woke with an urge to bite the brown loaf of my arm. The marks on my flesh faded by sundown. The sweetest meat clings, she insists. Peels a mango. Amber rivers trace her elbows. A trail of l'air du temps wafts in her wake. I follow it to her room, dab the scent on my wrists and throat. Evenings, she sang kundimans. Hating gabi. Nasaan ka irog? Carmen, Song of the Mangosteen Moon. Before you go, I want to give you something. She hands me a thimble painted with a map of Cuba. We've never been to Cuba. In the dream, a sister pours rosary beads into her cupped hands. Upon waking, a dead wasp curled in her palm. So while this book is mostly about loss, of memory, of loved ones, of time, it is also about reinventing the self and discovering the self after loss. So there are a number of self-portraits in this book. This one is self-portrait as rosary beads. These are my father's rosary beads. It was what I prayed with him the night before he passed away. He and my mom would pray the rosary every night. He would lead the rosary, and it gave them both great comfort to have this ritual. And so when they were both unable to do it themselves, I would help them along, and it seemed to be also a sort of source of consolation for them. Self-portrait as rosary beads. Curled amid lint and loose change, tucked in a jacket's satin lining, or crushed with used gum in seams of denim, I've known pain clinics and airports, taxi cabs and stale schoolrooms where time is a honeycomb in winter. I am olive wood, carnelian, plastic, black onyx. I'm rosebuds pressed into fragrant spheres. Your heat is my musk, your worry, my fire. Pick your mystery. If Tuesday, sorrowful. If Saturday, glorious. I've held you in grocery lines, picket lines, the hours between sleepless and woken. Hold me. I'm glass, shattered, smoothed by my mother's nerves, pillowed beneath her cheek. Counted, accountable, counting, counted on. Crystallized, dangled on a string or hung from a mirror in a river of traffic, praying for green, for an end, for a mutiny of rain. Litany of sorrows, of praise. I'm a crown of roses, a crown of purple thorns. I'm faithful as breadcrumbs on barbed wire. Lose me to birds or to night's starred thicket. Touch and be splintered, sundered, soothed, surrendered. My scent on your fingertips. So today I would like to especially remember my dad because it's actually his 2-year death anniversary. He died on June 7th, which it already is June 7th in Manila. And I realized since the book is mainly a record of my mother's descent into memory loss, into dementia, that reading from this book, I've often focused on my mother's life and celebrated her life. And there's this thing I heard on the radio about cumulative grief. It was on NPR yesterday. How when things happen, like losses happen in close succession, you sometimes don't even have the means to process both of them at the same way, even though the griefs hit you differently. So today, these next two poems are for my dad. The first one I wrote maybe 3 months after he passed, and it's one of the very few poems I've been able to write about him in the past year. Last. 4 days after the funeral, I carry my father's violin in its long brown box, sturdy, rectangular, built to last. In airport security, its round shoulders glide through plastic, swallowed by dark. It emerges beneath harsh light. It's September when I raise the lid, brush dust from the mute veneer he touched last spring, anointing a stuck peg. Sliding rosin on the bow. I remember the A string wouldn't tune. He played anyway. His body leaned and swayed in its wheelchair cage. I remember how the bow strained. Sundays were sacred for me and my dad because it was grocery day, which he loved. So I was his companion from my youngest days up to even later years when he was already in a wheelchair. The last time I read this poem was at his funeral. Reading this poem at my father's funeral, I choke on the word balsamic. Sundays, he took me along on his errands, mother on her midday siesta, sister in bed with a crossword. The afternoon was ours. Keys jangling in his free hand, my fingers wrapped in his other. We'd cross the concrete parking lot, 3 of my steps to each of his long strides. It's all business, his face read, but from his grip and the way his shoulders lurched forward, I knew the day held more. At the camera shop, Anna smiled behind the shiny counter, handing him the sealed Kodak packets of photographs from a family vacation. Once we bought rabbit ears at the hardware, metallic smells of commerce assaulting our senses. In the store, he'd study mother's list, her slanted script almost touching his thick glasses. He picked balsamic vinegar when the recipe called for white. Superman Band-Aids, Rocky Road ice cream. In the stationery store, he lingered, drawn by the scent of pencils, fresh reams of paper, rubber bands by the hundreds. I remembered his stories of the war, how his mother hoarded paper in every form, brown bags folded and refolded, moth-eaten receipts, calendars, the gray-white margins of newsprint on which he practiced his letters as a boy. The last item checked and bagged, we headed for the exit, arrested by garlic peanuts and Montoni's toothy grin. We held out paper cones. He filled them to the brim, greasy parchment warming our palms. Years ahead, when a trip to the store became a mere stop in a blur of chores, I'd remember stepping out of the sidewalk with my father, our cart freewheeling, bundles coming loose in the vast afternoon. And I have one last poem. It is the title poem of this book, What Happens Is Neither. My dad took care of my mother until his death. He always said he wanted her to go first so he could be there for her till the end, and he was. And then he passed 11 days later. So when he was in her last, when she was well into her last stages of dementia, one of the things he found as a way of communicating to her was his violin, which I have actually. I kept it. And as I said in the last poem, I brought it home. It's one of the few things I asked my siblings to give me out of my dad's things, because I used to play the violin, the piano to his violin when my mother couldn't play anymore. So it's become a talisman for me, really, of how music and how poetry can transcend language, especially when our own words, our usual words, fail. What happens is neither the end nor the beginning. Yet we're wired to look for signs. Consider the peonies. One makes a perfect bud after months of nothing. Another's leaves are ringed with black rot. How can I not think end? How can I not say beginning? Leaves fall when days shorten because a tree must reduce to its tough parts, twig, branch, bark. My mother sleeps away the daylight. She nods off while chewing a spoonful of fish and rice, her head a peony gone to seed. Father calls to say she doesn't recognize him. Turning to him, she cried out, certain a stranger was in her bed. He played his violin till she slept, a leaf in late fall curling into itself. In autumn, chlorophyll disappears, canceling green from leaves so yellow and magenta can blaze. In my mirror, I see her smile that favors a cheek, eyes slanting in the shape of small fish we eat for breakfast. Trees know best the now of things. What goes on has been going on for centuries. Washing dishes, I rest a foot on my standing leg. A fork clangs on the tile. I rinse a cracked cup. I try not to think of endings. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much, Angela. Thank you. That was very powerful. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our second poet, Caridad Moro-Gronlier, and her book, Tortillera. When I read this book, I realized that Caridad questions and dismantles normative expectations that a collective culture places on an individual whose sense of being and living differ from the established order. Love is the language that breaks, speaks, and then holds together the bodies, the people in these poems so fiercely, tenderly, and decisively. Let's hear some of those poems and welcome Caridad.
Thank you so much, Mildred, for that beautiful introduction. And thank you to my fellow readers. I'm thrilled to be with you today. And thank you for tuning in for a Sunday afternoon of poetry. So the book Tortillera borrows its title from a common homophobic slur that's applied to women, most particularly in my experience in the Cuban culture. So in writing the book and detailing the speaker's journey from being or trying to be a good Cuban girl and becoming the lesbian woman she was meant to be. And along that trajectory, I was looking at it today and it's sectioned in 3 sections. And I thought, this is kind of like a show where you have like season 1 cliffhanger, season 2 cliffhanger, and season 3. And I kind of loved that because even though within the arc of the book, there is this great big love that happens to the speaker, that love does not work out. And I think in writing it, sometimes we take chances for love that we might not have expected taking. And whether or not that love ends up being successful really isn't the point. It's about taking the chance on yourself and on your truth. So the book is very concerned with that. And it being Pride Month, I decided to kind of go delve into the poems that deal with that, the grappling with self as applied to through a lens that's reacting and responding to homophobia. So the first one I'm going to read is Cuban American Lexicon. And you know, there are things you find out after you've written a book about the book that you wrote, things that you don't even realize you were doing. And I realized that although these might have been poems written that at the time I thought were like big love poems, they're actually very concerned with language and the effect that language has on one's upbringing and cultural experience. So Cuban American Lexicon delves into that. En español, the word for girlfriend does not exist. Instead, I was his, novia, hyphen, intended, fiance, bride, in training. I was neither girl nor friend to the boy I chose. Duty down the aisle toward the altar, where novia turned into spouse, consort, wife, hyphen, esposa, en español, known also to mean shackle, manacle, handcuff. So that tells you a little bit about the upbringing, an idea. And that leads me to the next poem. In my high school, and this is a true story, it was so divided by ethnicity that we had, or culture, that we had a Cuban parking lot, because there were a lot of Cuban Americans in where I grew up in Miami, and there was an American parking lot, and the two didn't necessarily meet. But every once in a while, you'd meet someone from the other parking lot and kind of, you know, have a connection. And this speaks to that. What the white girl asked at our 20th high school reunion. Why weren't we friends in school? We weren't friends because I knew you hung out in the American parking lot, unlike my boyfriend who parked his Stingray in the Cuban one on the other side of school. Of course, I hung out there. Not that you would understand why being his girl meant I could not sit in your car at lunch and listen to your Def Leppard, your motley crew. Leave him to fend for himself. We weren't friends because he courted me old school, couched beside my father every Sunday while I served apprentice to my mother, her eyes onion stung, arms spattered with marrow and lard, who worked at loving her place at the stove. Rules I had not learned how to break yet. We weren't friends because I envied the way you weren't allowed to settle, how you were encouraged to date assorted breeds of boys who strutted across the lawn to ring your bell. Your dad waved his blessing out the door and didn't worry because he taught you to discern, to choose among them, taught you to drive yourself, headlights set on more than the slam of the same car door, even if it was a Corvette. So I have some poems that are like little time capsules of Miami, and I call them the Lincoln Road poems. Lincoln Road is now a very popular tourist destination, but once upon a time, it was where people went to be themselves and not necessarily in ways that they represented themselves within the milieu of family. It's where little in the closet gay girls went to be themselves. So this is that night at the Rackham Room. She talked me into a pool hall, strung out on tequila and cafecito, a gang of troubadours singing her praises. Damn, baby, you so fine, as we walked in. And she was the kind of girl who could get away with Brazilian jeans. I was coming off a bed rest pregnancy, skin stretched soft and loose, a half-racked game. But with her, I felt bold and pliable, shards of never say never stuck in my throat. I wasn't good at geometry or how to control the crash of the cue ball, the candy-coated orbs that scattered into constellations across the felt. But she kissed me for luck and took her shot, all angles and elbows, taking them down with a click of the stick. The suckers who lined up just to watch her bent over that table, hair blazing a trail toward the sun that rose out of the low-slung horizon of her waistline. A single dot that chased its tail into a swirl I rode, knowing even then everything spirals downward. But she kept shooting me smiles, sinking one after the other, me along with her. So all poets have greatest hits poets, and I am one of those. And the first poet that just kept me mired to her pages was Anne Sexton. So I wrote this as an homage to her, for my lover returning to her husband after Anne Sexton. He is all there, Disney promises, fairy tales, a cameo carved out of soap. He has always been there, buff and bench pressed, primped, posed, safe under glass. I was an indulgence. Cashmere draped across your thighs, brownie binge after years of salad, sweet cling peaches in February. His piece fits your puzzle, a perfect match. You see to the girls, the dog, the job, the mop. He writes checks that buy the best, orders the chaos you call your life, marked by a Swiss watch that minds minutes, but not children. He seated, round and female, your body filled with life. He put there, cocky as God. I give you back. I give you permission for the lava inside him spewing on your thighs, for the coward in him, the drinker, the liar, the teller of secrets who wanted to watch, for the pale scar on his nose, for the prize that is his face, for his strong man's arms and 7 white shirts, for the vasectomy, for the caretaker in you who will consider compromise when he burrows beneath you and tugs on the ribbons of your hair to tie you up, tie you to him, captive. He is comfortable, result of your childhood. Climb him like Everest. He is solid. As for me, I am makeup. I wash off. So there's a lot of metaphor to be found, I think, in the domestic sphere. And although it is obvious, for sure not my only sphere, it is one that I enjoy. So my mother loves that I love that because it gives us a little bit of common ground. So a lot of our best talks have been done over, crafting or redecorating is a big one. So this one's for her. Coming out to mommy. The cushions were beige, dinner partied, lived on, scrubbed clean as bleach would allow. She spoke of remodeling, 0% interest at rooms to go, how what couldn't be replaced could be reupholstered. We scoured fabric stores for bolts of cloth dark enough to mask my stains, strong enough to handle the strain of starting over, as if perfect squares of enchantment twill could contain the messiness of living. At home, I slid scissors across material she pressed into my hands. She watched as I struggled for straight lines, as I wept over jagged edges I could not control. She taught me to conceal irregularities, to pin them down beneath the sting of a staple gun, smooth new skin over battered innards, cushion after cushion reassembled, both of us sure I too could be remade. So Facebook was just getting started. I hate to date myself when some of these were written, and I reconnected with a lot of people. Well, not a lot, but a few of my closest friends from high school. And my life had changed significantly. Last time they saw me, I, had been married, and now I was out and very much partnered to a woman. So there were questions. So this is about that. For Marlene, who asked why I switched teams. One night at a party, I haggled with my date over a bottle of Pinot Noir and a corkscrew he refused to hand over. He wasn't a prick, just a man who thought the juice was his because he brought me, and that's what guys do. Even though he didn't have a clue how to handle the entry or the swivel of the screw, as if force could make anything come faster. He remained determined, despite the cork crumbling into flecks, his failure afloat the surface of what he'd sullied. A watchful brunette crossed the room, slid her body between us, slid his hands off the wine, slid her eyes down the bottle, and insinuated the tip of the screw deeper by turns, dislodged the cork in one fluid motion, and poured red velvet into my glass. Later, she spoke of Portuguese cork trees so evolved they had learned to ward off disaster, impervious to drought or fire, the chew of termites and chainsaws, trees capable of renewing their skins. I listened beneath a canopy of white sheets, another bottle breathing beside her bed. So I'm going to read a couple more. When the Pulse Massacre took place in Orlando, Florida, we had just gotten on a plane headed to the Pacific Northwest, and we drove from the Redwoods all the way to Seattle. So along the way, we did a lot of stopping at beaches, and on the radio, we just kept hearing mention to this tragedy. And one of the things that struck me was how the anchorman kept mispronouncing the names of the dead. And I thought, wow, you can't even, stop for 2 minutes to learn how to pronounce these names that you're using. So I used some of them in this poem. And also I was very struck by the driftwood and what it felt like on a beach that's so different from the beaches in my own state. So this is a memorial poem for those who lost their lives. Pulse, a memorial in Driftwood, Cannon Beach, Oregon. We have crossed a continent to cast 49 names into the sea. 49 nombres mangled by anchormen, Flores, Paniagua, San Feliz, on a beach strewn with the bones of giants, redwood, sequoia, Sitka spruce, behemoths that would not stay buried. Before the ruined beauty of this necropolis, saplings cleaved to elders, grew stronger in each other's arms as they danced in darkened groves, lit by the strobe of sunlight, dappled limbs akimbo, unprepared for annihilation, unprepared for the spilled sap, the glint of the axe, the buzzsaw, the prayers planted at the root of their destruction. I step over titans battered down to driftwood, stripped of tannin and pulp, bark bleached white as sheets, and offer 49 names to the sea, 49 nombres al mar. Here I can believe the ocean returns what she has given. So I was the editor for an anthology called Grabbed, and it was poets and writers responding to sexual assault. And I not only was I editor, but I was a contributing editor, but the experience really moved me. It was very powerful and very resonating in ways that I expect will last the rest of my life. It was astounding to me that an anthology of that sort had never been released. So I also found that it's kind of changed my new work. So I have a new piece that I am going to close out with today. And I thank the very brave and wonderful writers and poets who contributed to that anthology for giving me the strength and courage to write it. As to your comment that it could have been worse. Worse than the fact that I said yes to a last-minute fishing trip to Key Largo at 5 o'clock on a Friday, bare-limbed, mini-skirted, no repellent to ward off stingers out for blood. Worse than the untethered way I lived my adolescence, no cell phone or GPS, at best a couple of quarters in my purse, how I didn't say where I was going other than out, how I said, thank God, get me out of here, when he pulled in, how I tucked myself inside his car and kissed his cheek hello. Worse than that summer at Domino's, where I took the orders he delivered, how he split his biggest tips with me, how I'd lie to my parents and say I had to work late, only to ride shotgun and smoke pinners until he finished his route, how I endured the slice and sizzle of his cracked vinyl seats, the weed stench that came out of his vents, the tremble of broken axle, how I felt safe because he made me cry with laughter and called me little sister. Worse than my gratitude when he sprung for my shrimp platter combo at the Long John Silver's in Florida City. How chivalrous I thought him when he suggested the bathroom and warned me we had a ways to go. How I didn't ask where we were headed as he drove down Card Sound Road, the siren of stomach blaring with every mile marker we passed. How I chastised myself for the dread that pooled in my hands when he finally pulled over onto a canal-lined road where he winked and said he forgot the fishing poles. Worse than the bellow of gators in the squid ink dark with no flashlight or porch light, just headlights fixed on a dirt road, his hand on my thigh, his voice deeper by fathoms. Don't act like you thought we were really going fishing. Let me make you feel good. I bought you dinner, right? Worse than how I jumped out of the car with no map, no landmark, no sense of direction, no knowledge of the stars, just the image of the last payphone we'd driven past, the impossible arithmetic of the walk back to that glass booth, how there would be no one to call who would not blame me for getting in his car. Worse than how I thought to appease him, to empty my mind so he could enter my body, how I thought to lie there and let him take me in exchange for a ride. Worse than how my legs loosened when I said no, how his lip lifted into a snarl, how he shoved me to the ground and loomed over me, how I tugged at the hem of my skirt and willed it to lengthen as I chanted, please, until he unlocked the door, how he gave me 5 seconds to get in and made it inside as he yelled for. Worse than how he wound his hand through my hair and called me a tease, a cunt, a whore, little sister no more, as tears slid off my neck onto his braided fist, how he pulled over 3 times to tell me the least I could do was give him a hand job, threatening to make me walk every time I said no, how he littered my left thigh with right-handed rabbit punches, how I tallied the idle minutes spent at red lights between him and home, worse than how no one heard how hard I slammed his door, how his tires kicked up pebbles that pierced my knees when he peeled out of the driveway, how no one thought to rise from the couch and let me inside, how I could not steady my hands to unlock the deadbolt that resisted my house key. Worse than how I still ask myself, why the fuck did you wear that skirt? Thank you.
Very powerful. Thank you so much, Caridad. That's very moving and powerful. And now I have the pleasure to introduce our third poet and her book, Wild Kingdom. Jehanne Dubrow is the writer of Wild Kingdom, and she challenges the notion of academia as a real world riddled with jungle behaviors that divide participants into 2 groups, predators and prey. Imagine an island of birds, some just fledgling, struggling to survive. Who gets out alive? But most importantly, who has the right or conscience to live, to learn the correct pose of warrior in order to retrieve the self, the soul, and how does the poet rescue what's thrown away? Let's hear about that. Jehanne, you're welcome.
Thank you so much, Mildred. That was beautiful. And thank you so much to Caridad and Angela for reading such wonderful poems. So I'm going to read some work from my latest collection, Wild Kingdom. And Wild Kingdom, as Mildred said, explores the world of academia, and it examines the figures that populate what really is a pretty strange landscape. So faculty, administrators, and students. And these poems consider how the campus isn't really an ivory tower. Instead, it's become a screen onto which we project all of our anxieties about gender, religion, ethnic identity, and other complex issues. I frequently work in traditional poetic forms like the sonnet or the villanelle, but with Wild Kingdom, I chose instead to write in what I started calling received academic forms. So poems that mimic the landscape and the language of academic documents such as syllabi, rubrics, departmental minutes. I also wrote a lot about my years of serving on a student honor board, where I participate in adjudicating cases having to do with plagiarism, theft, sexual account, and substance abuse. It was really important to me in writing this book that I considered the perspective of students who, after all, spend 4 years on campus eating, sleeping, studying, and socializing. Finally, I want to say we've all heard that academic politics is the most vicious and bitter form of politics because the stakes are so low. But I want to argue that, in fact, the stakes couldn't be higher. So I think Wild Kingdom is a pretty dark book about cruelty and power. But I was always trying to ask myself, how can I do better as a colleague, as a teacher, as a scholar? And how can we all ensure that our institutions of higher learning continue to nurture students and to remain places of brave thinking? So I'm going to start with the opening poem in the book, which is called Syllabus for the Dark Ahead. Throughout this course, we'll study the American landscape of our yard, coiled line of the garden hose, muddy furrows in the grass, awaiting our analysis, what's called close reading of the ground. And somewhere, something will yip in pain, perhaps, a paw caught in a wire, or else the furred and oily yowl of appetite. And flickering beyond the fence, we'll see the slatted lives of strangers. The light above a neighbor's porch will be a test of how we tolerate the half illumination of uncertainty, a glow that's argument to shadow. Or if not that, we'll write an essay on the stutter of the bulb, the little glimmering that goes before the absolute of night. So throughout this, the writing of this book, I was thinking about my own experiences as an academic. I first began to write this book because I experienced what's known as academic mobbing, which is a really vicious form of group bullying in which a target is identified and then erased from the planet through tactics of shame, gaslighting, and other forms of cruelty. Once you've been mobbed, you start to see it everywhere. And so you'll hear how some of these poems don't just talk about academia, but they talk about the larger political stage as well. So this poem is called Portrait of an Administrator with Strategic Plan and Office Supplies. To sit on her couch was to be silenced by upholstery, plushed muffling of cushions from which it was difficult to rise. Arendt writes, in politics, obedience and support are the same. And for a time, I was obedient. My reports in ordered bullets, collaborations, programs, opportunities. The provost preferred speech contained, a line of staples in a box. I remember the fold between 1 week and the next. She said to me, these people are unreasonable. She said, these people are quite reasonable. Inside her office, everything was cream. She told me what I heard, I hadn't heard. Our last meeting, like a memo full of typos, whited out, then shuffled through the copier machine. Language turned to shiny blurs. Arendt writes, most people will comply. For a time, it was easy to ignore the sharp wedge of the provost's hair. I should have seen she resembled more a letter opener on a desk, how like a knife the piece of metal looks. I told her what I heard, I heard. I told her that my expertise was words. Arendt writes, the holes of oblivion do not exist. A gifted bureaucrat, the provost taught me truth was thin as paper. The little circles she punched in it remain, and still I hold this punctured story to the light. So this next poem contains a number of appearances of the F word. So if you're sensitive to that kind of language, I recommend muting this next poem. It's called Self-Portrait with Cable News Graffiti Weather. When I see the woman on TV, so calm in her porcelain white suit, I remember that I too smiled while man talked over, that I bore the persistent tar of his voice. In those meetings, I watched the veins in his face like cracks in a disappointed street. Were it not for his cruelty, I might have said, I'm sorry for your loss. Who knows? That year, my husband would overhear me talking in my sleep, and though he couldn't open the shut door of dreaming, he told me that I said, fuck you into the dark, quite clearly, fuck you. Night and waking were locked rooms, the only exit, a stuck window, and the heat was always going or the cold. Next order of business, a colleague said. I noted every conversation. On the page, no one interrupted. Often, remembering that year, I hold a serving bowl, touch its surface limbed with flowers. This thing I've dropped or knocked against a shelf, the way it refuses decorative to break. Now I can say fuck you quite clearly to that year, although there was also the kindness of friends who brought over cherries. They knew I loved the sweetness of a stone. I can say fuck you. I will not lose the taste for it. In that year, I was, truth be told, willing to punch a fist through glass if it meant my escape. I walked down Greenwood Avenue, past the house where someone had sprayed fuck you on the road and someone else had tried to X it out, pale lines on top of lines. I understood wanting to write one's fury on a place. I understood even the impulse to erase it, walking each day across that imperative, how it disturbed the concrete silence. Most of us are not the woman on TV who keeps talking while the man is shouting wrong into a mic. She keeps talking while he stands behind her like a mugger in an alleyway and who knows what he wants to take. Most of us are the audience watching the debate. We comply when the moderator says no applause, no interruptions, please. Most of us wait for night to write fuck you on a clean patch of asphalt. All of this to say, I could have said much more. I could have written something on the man's sad face. I think of him. I think of Greenwood Avenue, its unremarkable houses that I learned to hate, always moving toward a meeting or coming late from one. I think of the sound that spray paint makes, the rattle shake of the can, the aerosol's soft hiss, the words emerging slowly on a path, jagged perhaps, but large enough, remaining legible through rain. And this next poem was inspired by my experience, which I suspect is like a lot of people's experience, of watching Christine Blasey Ford testify and thinking how familiar her testimony sounded. So this poem is called After Crying. For years on the college honor board, I asked about the body and its boundaries. Who owns that place? Who enters it? And then the respondent, as he was called, would arrange his mouth into a room of grief. On the TV, a woman is remembering a hand across her face. She thought that he might kill her accidentally. Indelible, she says, in the hippocampus is the laughter. The past is a hallway that the mind cannot escape. For years on the College Honor Board, I spoke with men. They talked about themselves as boys, with names like Matt or Brett, who held their power casually in the same easy way they might have carried cans of beer through a party. A man is weeping on the screen today. Even now, he's secure in his confidence, like one of those houses on a sheltered street where the trees go on for miles. On the honor board, I saw how we judge the worth of lamentation. The men with their shuttered eyes, their bodies unbreachable. We placed their tears in bright decanters on a mantelpiece. We spill the tears of women in the garden to water the silky roses and the vines. So here's another one of these received academic forms. This one sort of inspired by the kinds of academic procedural documents that professors are often asked to draft, which have nothing to do with the life of the mind or with educating students. It's called Exit Report. In this report, the poet will retrieve her heart from the gods. You'll know her heart by the way it was feasted on. In this report, she'll unchain her wrists from the rock, When the ocean arrives, she'll already be gone. In this report, she'll guide her ship unruined through a strait of teeth and swirling. Reporting, she won't be a monster at the heart of a maze, or will be monstrous and follow the thread, rescue her bull-headed body from the punishment of kings. In this report, she won't be held in the downy smothering of a swan. Nothing will trick her with desire's shifting shape. What she reports will make everything gold. The table where she sat so many years, the years themselves now hardened in their cruelty, such glimmering in this report. Nor will she be turned to stone when facing herself in the polished shield of this report. The snakes of her won't stop their hissing. In this report, the wax won't melt, her wings incapable of not beating. Look how she loves the heat, the feather singe, and the water far below, like a darkness she is leaving. I'll admit that I love Greek mythology, and that poem is certainly inspired by some of my favorite Greek myths. When I left the school where I'd been kind of tortured for a number of years, on the day that I submitted my resignation, I developed laryngitis. And I've never felt so empowered and disempowered as I did on that day, feeling so delighted that I was getting to leave. And at the same time, my voice being so raspy and tiny. So this poem is inspired by that. It's called Fairy Tale with Laryngitis and Resignation Letter. You remember the mermaid makes a deal. Her tongue evicted from her throat and moving is a knife cut with every step. This is what escape from water means. Dear colleagues, you write, for weeks I've been typing this letter in the bright kingdom of my imagination. Your body is a ship of pain. Pleasure is when you climb the rocks and watch the moonlight touching everywhere you want to go. A silver world called far away. Dear colleagues, you write, this place is a few sentences contained by the cursor's rippling barrier. What happened here is only beaks and brackets, the serif's liquid stroke. The old story has witches, a prince in love with the surging silence of women, a knife that turns the water red. You write, dear colleagues, now these years are filed in the infinite oceans of bureaucracy. Everything bleaches or fades. In other words, goodbye. Sometimes it's possible to walk, although you've been told inside the oyster shell of your heart, there is no soul. Creatures like you must end as a spray of salt, green droplets floating breathless in the air. And I'm just going to read two more poems. This is another Greek mythology inspired poem. It's called Memory of a Year with Allusions to the Greeks. When I had company, it might have been the classicist who sat with me. He would have called that year Cloud Cuckoo Land. We worked in a place of claw and pinion, beak. Outside, a shadow bird was calling on the branch, all signs gesturing at catastrophe. Some ancient playwright said, grief's an avalanche whose weight we cannot stop. Of course, I'm paraphrasing here. We rolled boulders to a hilltop. We commiserated in the maze of our small suffering. The Greeks would have named the classicist kind-natured. He told me once he hated how that year had smashed the clay of him, breathed anger in his lungs. Beyond my window, the great green lawn remained indifferent. And in the warmer months, students drowsed on towels, golden figures in the light. And then Sudden as a crane that lowers gods onto the stage, the classicists and I were both leaving, a strange departure from the mythology. We were leaving even the monster of that year, the many-headed one, so hungry it would feed upon its own serrated self. I don't remember our goodbye. I hope somewhere he's still explaining what the Greeks believed about pain, how the body keeps on bleeding and we spit the poison out. That snake-bitten ear, I'll strike it in revenge for how it wounded us. I'll string the bow, I'll send the arrow through a dozen iron rings. And I'm going to end with this very small poem. That's actually the first poem I wrote in the book. When I moved to Texas, I fell in love with these darkish purple-black birds that are everywhere here in Texas. They're called grackles. And I loved them because they could make beauty out of garbage. And I thought, wow, that's a sign of resilience. I want to be like the grackle. So this is Song for a Grackle in the Kroger parking lot. Don't hate the scavenger. In daylight, it's purple stained, iridescence of oil spilled on asphalt, its body like a rag wrung out. Love instead, that groups are known as plagues, grievances. Love, the reflective eye that stares, how everywhere is home. Time has a way of driving over us. Love, the choice the grackle makes, to tear the silver insides of a candy wrapper, to pick apart the leavings, to sing and sing despite the rusted metal of its throat. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That is so powerful. And I have absolutely enjoyed hearing all you three read your work, just getting your voices and the way your work is infused with the right energy and anger and questions, but also humor. Even when you're really writing about dark subjects, you still manage to infuse humor and joy in your work. And we don't have a question from the audience, and that's really just as well because we're almost coming to the end of the hour. I appreciate all of you sparing your Sunday afternoon to share your work with us. And I hope in the link that was provided to the readers, to the listeners, there's a way to order these books from Malaprops and also directly from the publishers so that you can continue to read and enjoy all the poems that we couldn't listen to during this time. And I would also like to use this last minute to mention that I look forward to having you again next reading, July 4th, where I'll have 3 new poets reading from their work. And I will also have maybe new listeners and also the established usual supporters of Malaprops being with us. My name is Mildred Barya and I host the Poetrio sessions. It's been wonderful to have this afternoon of delightful poems. Thank you and stay well.